more attention to the fact that we come every week to remember the ultimate sacrifice that Jesus did for us. Not just for our nation and for our freedoms that we have here, but for the freedoms that we have to live in Christ and eternity, the gift that he gave to us through that. But today, I want to talk about trusting in God. It's something I've learned over the past few years, big time. It's definitely something that I've had to work at, and I've grown tremendously through just all the different circumstances leading up to today. First thing I want to look at first is Matthew 28, the Great Commission, right? 19 through 20. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, of the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I commanded you, and lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Look at this, we look at go all the time. It means like as you go, or as you're going into the world, we kind of attribute that as part of the action. But the main command of this section here is make disciples. Without getting too technical, I know most of you probably know me and Mike took a Greek class, but there are different actions which are called, this one is the central imperative command, and some others are participles. So go is not necessarily the command, but make disciples is the command that Jesus gives us here. Breaking down language sometimes seems like, well, it's kind of splitting hairs or anything like that, but it does help with the preciseness. God chose Greek for the New Testament, and Greek is very precise in its meanings, which helps big time when we're trying to decipher certain things. It can be very confusing to understand Greek. Ask me how I know. But when handled correctly, it can kind of clear up some of the muddy waters and some controversial scriptures. But that's not where I'm going with today. So baptizing and teaching them are considered participles. Participles are used like adjectives. Don't ask me to define participle either, so I couldn't do that. So in this passage, they're the adjective to the verb, which is make disciples. So they're describing how we should make disciples. We should baptize them, and we need to teach them. The church in general usually gets the first part. We get them in the water, get them back out, and we're like, yeah, and then we move on to the next one. But we're not so concerned with the teaching part. That is the other action describing what we should be doing. We lack on that. And that's not something that's specific to Brunson or even Michigan or even the U.S. That's just something that we don't always follow up on. We don't always do the best to teach new converts. But however, what we're supposed to do is to teach new converts how to persevere in this life, what to do now that they're a blood-bought, baptized believer. But this idea of teaching is something that we do need to do, and we need to focus more on. We hear all the time that there's a preacher shortage, or we need preachers. There's just not preachers in the pulpit anymore, things like that. But preachers aren't the problem. The lack of preachers isn't the problem. It's the lack of Christians. True, dedicated Christians that want to live for God, that trust God, that want to do more for Him. That's what we're missing. If the church had dedicated Christians, the teaching would come naturally. We would have teachers in classrooms. We would have Sunday school teachers. We would have preachers in the pulpit. We would have deacons, elders. We'd have all these things that the church in general lacks. We would see a massive movement in the world if we had dedicated Christians. But all this stuff would come natural, and then the prayers of God, whatever you will, I will. Whatever you want for my life, I will do. And those are not easy prayers to pray, because God may take you up on that. But we need dedicated Christians to be able to pray that prayer. But how many of you this morning will be able to pray that prayer? Will be willing to do that? God, use me in whatever capacity that you want me to be used. Whatever you have in store for me, I will do. We don't like to put ourselves in uncomfortable situations. We don't like to go out of our way, outside of our box, outside of our routine. We like to be comfortable. As Americans and just in people in general, the way technology is advanced, we always try to make things more comfortable for ourselves. Even in my house, I can tell Alexa to turn the lights on and off, because I don't want to get up and go flip the switch. And I'll admit, sometimes I'll sit in my office, the light switch is I just reach up a little bit and grab it. I'll get on my phone and turn it off. And I don't know if it's lazy or whatever, but, I just put those things in place because I want to be comfortable. It's convenient for me. But don't get complacent. Don't get lazy in your lives and get comfortable so much that we're not worried about other people. We put God on the back burner. We don't want to do other things because it's not going to fit in our routine. It's not going to fit what I have to do today. Life will throw us curveballs. God will throw us curveballs, and we need to be able to react to those. So do we really, as Christians, put our trust in God? Or do we say we do, but then our actions say something else? We just take things in our own hands and push God aside. I can honestly say that's what I used to do. There were many times I would tell God, if you do this for me, or when I get to this point in my life, then I'll do something for you. And it's kind of humbling to even think back about those things and what was I thinking? Honestly, and those were the things that I would tell God. When this happens to me, I'll do something for you. But my point this morning is this: are you willing to trust God so much that even when it doesn't make sense to our viewpoint and to people around us? So that brings me to my main text this morning. We're going to be in Joshua 5, if you have your Bibles, and some of the verses will be up as we go. But this text is going to be 40 years after they left Egypt, when Moses was called, Pharaoh and all the plagues, and then they were led out of Egypt, and they kept messing up, doing all these things, and God caused them to wander in the desert for 40 years because of their disobedience, because of their unbelief, because of their trust in God, their lack of trust. They had to wander in the wilderness. So here it is. Moses died. Technically, Joshua is Moses' successor. He is the new leader of the people of Israel. And the reason they had to wander in the desert is because they didn't obey, right? They didn't trust. And only a few of them were found faithful, and they were the ones that were allowed to enter into the promised land, Joshua being one of them. So verse 1, read there. Now it came about when all the kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan to the west, and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea, heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan before the sons of Israel until they had crossed, that their hearts melted, and there was no spirit in them any longer because of the sons of Israel. Everyone heard about the things that God was doing, and in the surrounding nations, everybody knew about the Israelites and God, and they heard that God had done some amazing things. They had a fear of God, the God of Israel. Have you ever visited somewhere or just met somebody and you shake their hand or whatever it is, and they're like, "Oh, I've heard a lot about you." And you're like, is that good or bad? And your reputation precedes you. This is exactly what's happened here. All the surrounding nations heard what God was doing to all the people, and God's reputation preceded him. They knew, they had a fear. They knew what to expect if the Israelites came around, where God was going to be right behind them or in front of them. Now imagine doing things like parting the Red Sea, pillars of fire to lead the people, providing people food and water in the desert for 40 years, military conquest with powers that no man could conjure up on their own. God's reputation preceded him, and everybody knew that he was, again, leading the Israelites. Remember, if we kind of remember back to Joshua chapter 2, Rahab, she says, "I know that the Lord has given you this land," and she's aware of this. She says, "Hey, we all know that you're coming here. God's told you can have this, and we're terrified." She was someone that had a little bit of an unholy profession, right? And when she heard the stories of God and what God has done, she believed in him. And even said that the hearts of the people melted, that they had no courage because of what God had done. So all the surrounding people were terrified to stand against Israel. She heard the news, she believed that God could save her, and she acted on her faith and trusted that God would allow her and her family to be delivered. This process of what she went through is kind of familiar to what we see today, right? We hear and understand the gospel. We believe that God is doing the things that he said he will do. We take action, rising up to be baptized, and trusting that God will do each one of us what he says he's going to do. So verse 2. At this time the Lord said to Joshua, "Make for yourselves flint knives and circumcise again the sons of Israel the second time." I'm not a scientist, but I don't think you can be circumcised twice. It's like a one and done thing. And so, but we'll get to that in verse 4, explaining that part a little bit more. But Joshua didn't question God. And it's not even recorded that the men had any issue with this. They trusted God in the conditions that they would be in. Nothing could be more foolish from a military standpoint, from just a normal thinking, sane person standpoint, that being behind enemy lines, that they should go through circumcision. And the Israelites definitely would have known the story of Shechem and Dinah, Jacob's daughter, Genesis chapter 34. And so in that situation, Dinah went to town to go do whatever it was she had to do. I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit. And Shechem was like, she's beautiful. And he took her and by force and defiled her. Her brothers were not thrilled, to say the least. And so Shechem asked his daddy, Hamor, and said, "Would you buy her for me?" And tried to make a deal with Jacob at this time. And Dinah's brothers told him, they would intermarry if they wanted to make a deal, if they were circumcised. And so Hamor's people, and they thought about it, it's not a bad idea, And then so they went to the people and said, "Hey, we got all these benefits. Well, they'll be with us. We can be rich, all these things." And everybody's like, "Yeah, sounds like a good idea." And so they circumcised everybody. And then on the third day, while everybody was still in pain, Jacob's sons went out and wiped everybody out. Went in when they were defenseless, went in when they had no opportunity to fight back, and killed all the people. Jacob wasn't too thrilled about that, and there were some repercussions, but Joshua's men would have known the vulnerable state that they would be in, that they would be easily able to be attacked, and there would be definitely no condition to fight back. But they had to trust in God. They had so much trust in God that they knew that He could take care of them and protect them, even when it would be so easy to overtake them. Their faith in God was shown by their actions. I can imagine they told God that they trust Him to be faithful to His promises, kind of like how Abraham didn't ask questions about sacrificing Isaac. He knew God could take care of the situation no matter what. I would even go as far to say that this generation of Israel was probably the most faithful generation of the Israelites at any given time. They had few people that made some poor decisions in this time, but collectively, they were the most trusting of God. A few years ago, I made God a promise. I said I would go wherever you would use me. I was tired of the attitude that I have. When I have time or the energy, then I'll do something for God. I was nervous to even say or think that promise to God, because I've made promises before and never kept them. How many of us have we made promises to God, I'll do this, and then don't follow through? But I was nervous to think that, but I made the decision to jump in and pursue ministry, whatever it looked like. I said, God, whatever you want, I will do. Psalms 31:14 says, "But as for me, I trust in you, Lord. O Lord, I say, you are my God." I jumped in both feet first. I didn't know what it would look like, where I would be, what I'd be doing. I just knew that whatever happened, I had to put God first and make that my decision. Everything else would fall into place. And where we were, I was in a position where shutting down my business didn't make sense financially, didn't make sense logically. I just bought lots of equipment to get into excavation. I bought a dump truck earlier that year. I just bought a ton of money, spent a ton of money on a skid steer, bought specialty tools, all these things. I spent a lot of money investing in growing my business. And from a financial standpoint, from a worldly standpoint, it just didn't make sense to just throw it away. This is about as close as my dream job as I could have got doing the things. I love driving my dump truck. I love driving my skid steer and things like that. But Proverbs 3, verse 5 says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding." It didn't make sense. But I trusted God. I said, I make this promise to you. whatever happens, I know you've got it in your hands. I will do what needs to be done. And I'm not saying these things to, like, look how faithful I am. I trust in God and you guys don't. That's obviously not. Because I have my own set of struggles. I have my own set of things I struggle with. What might not seem something hard for somebody else, I struggle with. I have a hard time sitting down and focusing on reading and studying and doing these types of things. So being a Bible student has not been easy. And that's just one of my problems, I guess I would say. But what may be hard for others, what might be hard for some of you, to just quit your job is easy for me. There were many circumstances that led up to this and allowed me to make these what might seem like rash decisions and allowed me to attend Bible college than it would be easier for somebody else. Growing up, my family was always spontaneous. We've always done things on a whim, and that's just how we grew up. I can remember I've shared this story with a few people, but I can remember being in the Taco Bell drive-thru. It would have been probably 4th of July or something like that, or a holiday when my dad had off. And him and my mom turned around and looked back and says, "You guys want to go to Arizona?" And so we're like, me and my brother look at each other like, "Really?" Like, "Yeah." Okay. So we got our Taco Bell, went home, packed up a few things, and drove out to Arizona. And it's just off the cuff. And I remember asking my dad about it, and he's like, "Yeah, we weren't planning that. It's just we talked about it. We just brought it up in the drive-thru, and off we went." And visited my grandparents. So it's just, that's how I grew up. We didn't grow up with plans and structures and things like that, but we weren't irresponsible either. Doesn't mean that we weren't cautious in some of the things that we've done. But though some may see that as irresponsible. But I came to grips with the fact that I could do more than I was willing to do, but I wanted God to build me up first. I said, "God, take care of the things that I have, take care of the things that I want, and then, again, I will do what you want," instead of allowing God to use me where I was. So verse 3. So Joshua made himself flint knives and circumcised the sons of Israel at Gibeath-ha-Erloth. I've seen different translations or pronunciations of that word, so don't hold me to that if it's wrong. But Gibeath-ha-Erloth literally means the hill of foreskins. I know it's kind of a weird thing to talk about, but this was a sign of being under God's covenant, and it was a requirement to be able to celebrate the Passover and to be obedient to God's command. And again, not to be weird, but the amount of flesh that would have to be there to make a hill big enough to be named would be a lot, and surely would have been noticed by the people of Jericho. And then, imagine the conversations in Jericho at this time. And just seeing all this stuff going on, and they're like, now it seems like a good time to attack. And someone's like, "Whoa, man, no." Have you heard the stories? And just the things that would go on in Jericho, but they're vulnerable. And it's kind of a weird thing to think about, but it'd be interesting to see what was going on in the mind of the people. Joshua chapter 5, looking at the next verse there, 4 through 7. This is the reason why Joshua circumcised them, and all the people who came out of Egypt were males. All the men of war died in the wilderness along the way they came out of Egypt. For all the people who came out were circumcised, but all the people who were born in the wilderness along the way as they came out of Egypt have not been circumcised. For the sons of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness until all the nations, that is, the men of war who came out of Egypt, perished because they did not listen to the voice of the Lord. To whom the Lord had sworn that he would not let them see the land that the Lord has sworn to their fathers to give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. Their children who have raised up in their place Joshua circumcised, for they were uncircumcised because they had not been circumcised along the way. So because of the disobedience of this group's fathers, they had to pay the penalty. They were forced to wander. These men had to be circumcised at an age other than 8 days old. And they were unable to partake in the Passover, technically, because of their uncircumcision. Whether or not there was probably, I was doing some study on this part of it, they probably did take the Passover as God commanded it, and then the men who were in Israel for the 40 years that died off, they would have practiced Passover, and doesn't mean that they didn't do, checks when they were taking the Passover and say, "Hey, Are you all, you circumcised before you take over the Passover," and things like that. There weren't checks like that. So to say whether or not these this particular group celebrated the Passover. We would assume that they did, but there's no evidence that they didn't. Anyways, they were in a place of extreme vulnerability because of their condition, and they knew that the reason that the new generation was not circumcised is because of the fact that because God rejected their fathers, and they didn't see the need to pass on the sign of the covenant that they had with God to their children. So when Joshua said that they need to be circumcised, it was a sign, it was a refreshment for this group of people that God was with them again. So this is a type of practice or a foreshadowing of what our baptism is. This signifies the cutting off of the flesh, the filth of the flesh, spiritually, that's done in our hearts. Just as circumcision was the sign of the covenant that they had with God, baptism is now the way that we are entered into God's covenant today. And circumcision was done on the 8th day, and the 8th day speaks of resurrection to a new life. Because we are baptized and raised to a new life, we died to the old life, we cut off the filth of our old life, and we cut off the body of sin. Let me ask you, are you living a life that proves that you are no longer connected to the sin that you left in the water, or do you still carry that burden with you? We have the opportunity to leave it behind and give that stuff up, give the life that we had up for Christ that frees us. These types of things are easier said than done to just, give away our sins and no more. And it's not as easy as we would like it to be, because once we leave here, we have to go face the world again. But where do you put your faith? Do you put your faith in God, or do you put your faith in the cares of the world and the things that we struggle with? Psalms 37:3, trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and cultivate faithfulness. Joshua 5:8 says, now when they had finished circumcising the nation, they remained in their places in the camp until they were healed. And so, looking at the time frame, they would have crossed the Jordan on the 10th, as was recorded, and they would have been down for the count and for a little while. And on the 14th, they celebrated Passover. So it was about 3 days, and then until they celebrated Passover. Joshua 4:19 tells us the day. It says, now the people came up from the Jordan on the 10th of the first month and camped at Gilgal on the eastern edge of Jericho. So that's where we get that date from. Again, this whole scene of circumcision and crossing the Jordan, all these things, doesn't make any sense from a military standpoint. And you have to think, again, what's going on in Jericho. There's confusion. What are these people doing? There's fear. Like, what's going to happen to us? This God that has delivered them, and just watch them cross over the Jordan, things like that. And I could imagine there's probably anger. These people are taunting us. And they're toying with us. They're celebrating their religious practices. They're doing rituals and doing these things and having feasts right on our doorstep. But Israel had no fear. They only had trust and obedience. When we have people come in, we baptize them. We shouldn't be just willing to send them back out to the wolves, right, of the world. But for so many people today, Sundays are the only Christianity that a lot of people see in a week. They're surrounded by the world. They're surrounded by lies. They're surrounded by evil. And for us as Christians, it's easy for us to just, pat them on the back and send them on their way. And, we said a prayer with them. We dunked them in the water. And, how are we going to help them figure everything out? How are we going to help them with the next step? How are we going to help them trust God? We need to put yourself out there to help these people along. It's okay to be inconvenienced. It's okay to stay after a little bit, and you might not get to where you wanted to go right away. It might be okay to change lunch plans. But we need to show them what true Christianity looks like, that we're willing to sacrifice our own time for somebody else, for them. Now, one thing I kind of thought about a little while back, we look at the moon. You ever seen the moon? It's just like, wow, the moon is shining so bright. It's like the moon looks beautiful tonight. And the moon doesn't actually put off any light. It doesn't produce light. The moon is just a reflection of the sun. The sun is the one that produces the light, and because of the surface and reflective and all the natures of the moon, we have a reflection. We see what is just reflection of the sun. We are the same way as Christians. We have no light in us. We don't produce light. We don't have the properties, the capabilities to show light to the world. We are merely a reflection of Jesus, the Son. So to look back at the beginning here, Jesus said we need to make disciples. This isn't a charge to preachers. This isn't a charge to elders or deacons. This is a charge for Christians, every single one of you here. Each and every one of us are told to follow these rules, and if we're to be considered a follower of God, we're to be found faithful to Christ no matter the circumstances. So if God's opening doors for you or placing you in situations where he wants you to be used, don't ignore it. You know, the whole reason, I kind of said a little bit, that I got into ministry was I wasn't doing what I thought I should be doing. I had ideas that I wanted to do. I can remember discussing things and saying, you know, when Jerry went to the Bahamas, I was like, man, that'd be such a cool thing to be able to do. I would love to do that. And I was looking, and, you know, one of my dream goals is to own an airplane and fly an airplane someday. And it's just like, you know, God, when I have an airplane, I'll be able to take stuff down to the Bahamas. Like, I'll fly supplies in, I'll fly water, Bibles, whatever. You know, I will do that when I have an airplane. I'll do things like that. And then I just really started struggling with all these things and where I was going with my business and things like that. And I was questioning everything. And, you know, what was my purpose? What was my goals with the things that I was doing? Is it, you know, I wasn't doing enough. The whole reason I got into construction and left my job in the first place was to be able to spend time with my family, go to camps, do more for the church, do all these things, and here I am, you know, doing some of it, but I wasn't living up to what I said I would be doing. And so I was like trying to make changes and focus on one thing. Like, we're going to hone in on excavation, we're going to do this. And then I went to camp that year, and would have been 2021. Alistair Hall came and spoke. He's with Hippo Valley Christian Mission, which is where I'm going. Spoke on the mission, and Terry Carter, the president of Summit Theological, where I go to school, was also speaking. And so their messages was exactly the questions I was asking myself. You know, what am I doing to do for God? What am I doing? You know, am I so focused on myself? And am I didn't know enough too. And so, like, all these things I was battling with, God knew exactly what he was doing. He had everything lined up. And so when I get there, I hear all this stuff. I'm like, this is exactly the things I've been dealing with. These are exactly the questions I've been asking. So I approached Terry, and I do all these things. And, you know, I asked Jason about school, and I talked to Al a little bit about the mission. I'm like, you know, these things are what I want to do. And, you know, mission stuff, I love the idea of mission stuff and just doing things for other people. And I'm like, I can do that. And so, you know, I came home, told my wife, and I was like, hey, you know, what if I quit my job, go to Bible college, and go, you know, be a preacher, do ministry, whatever? And she said, that's kind of crazy, but okay. You know, and so just the idea of quitting our livelihood, the thing that, you know, brought home money and fed us and bought us a house and all these things and gave us our life, just going to leave it behind, you know, and then just go into the unknown and you know, and these types of things. But the faith of my wife, being able to trust God that much too, wasn't just my faith. She backed me up. And so having this type of faith just allowed us to go on. But God doesn't need each one of you to quit your job and to do something radical. He can use you right where you are if you're willing to be used. He just wants you to trust him. That's the point. God wants you to trust him that he can take care of you. You know, he says he can take care of the little sparrow, the little bird. Then why do we worry about the things that we worry about if God loves you so much more than the little bird or, you know, the flowers of the field? But I do have a warning, though. If you pray a prayer of, God, use me wherever you want me, this isn't to discourage you or to scare you from trusting in God, but be ready to answer that, you know, have that prayer answered. Be ready and willing to be used by God. You know, you might not think you're a great leader, a great speaker, a great preacher, teacher, whatever it might be, or even able to do these things, but, you know, God doesn't call qualified people, right? Gideon was one of the greatest commanders of God's army here on earth, and he was a coward. And Jesus' own disciples were just a ragtag bunch of misfit people that were looked down upon in society, weren't anything special, but they changed the world. Me, myself, I'm just a nobody, trying to tell everybody all about somebody that saved my soul. And I encourage each one of you to do the same. And so if you're here this morning and you haven't given your life to Christ and you haven't made that decision to do these things, to lay it on the line, to trust God that He can take care of you and to do the things that He wants to do in your life, you can come forward and we can encourage you and talk with you and tell you what that means and guide you in that decision to the best decision you can make in your life.